Good evening, and welcome to the National Museum of American History. I'm Brent Glass, director of the museum, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of our guests here this evening and welcome our panelists, who you will meet shortly. The National Museum of American History has a unique mission. We're the only museum in the country, the only museum in the world, in fact, that has the mission of telling the full sweep of American history. That includes our political history, our military, social, cultural, economic history. And we do that through our research, through our collections, through exhibitions, through our websites, and through public programs. And one way of understanding, or an important way of understanding American history, is to understand the American dream. And the American dream, when you think about the American dream, you think about freedom, about opportunity, about education, about search and commitment to justice. And the American dream is an ideal. It represents the ideals and values and traditions of our country. But the American dream is not a given. It is something that involves overcoming barriers. The American dream is a work in progress. It's not a finished product. And I think about that when I think about this evening's program, which is this museum's featured Hispanic Heritage Month event, which marks the 40th anniversary of the Delano Grape Strike in 1965, when Filipino and Mexican-American farm workers began a strike against grape growers in California. And you'll hear about all these details related to those events very shortly. But this, I can't think of a topic that illustrates in very dramatic ways both the promise and the challenge of the American dream. I want to mention a story that may not be familiar to many of you, but just to show how this event and the events of the Delano Grape Strike echoed through the entire country. I worked in Pennsylvania for many years, and one of the events in the labor history of Pennsylvania was the Latimer Massacre, which occurred up in the anthracite region of Pennsylvania in 1897. And in 1972, the state of Pennsylvania agreed to put a historical marker, to dedicate a historical marker to the Latimer Massacre, where 26 ethnic coal miners were killed on a single day by a sheriff and his deputies in a little town outside of Hazleton, Pennsylvania. So to commemorate the Latimer Massacre, and eventually the Latimer Massacre led to the formation of the United Mine Workers. To commemorate that event, the state dedicated a historical marker, and they invited as their guest speaker for that event Cesar Chavez. So to think of someone coming from the grape growing region of California to the anthracite region in Pennsylvania, and to see that connection is something that I thought about when I knew we would be mounting our exhibit and having this program this evening. I'm very honored that the museum is hosting tonight the leaders of this movement, and I want to welcome our panel. Ms. Dolores Huerta, co-founder. I don't think I need to make any other introduction, but I do need to say that Ms. Huerta received the James Smithsonian Medal in 2001, so it's wonderful to have you here with us. Mr. Luis Valdez, founder of El Teatro Campesino. And Mr. Valdez has been on many museum programs, and we welcome you back to the museum. Also, Mr. Andy Imutan, organizing leader of the Filipino workers in the Delano Grape Strike, so welcome to you. And Congressman Grijalva from California.
From Arizona.
From Arizona, I'm sorry.
Tucson.
We're honored to have you here, whatever state you're from, any of you, whatever states you're from. Excuse me, Congressman. And we're also honored to have as our moderator, Maria Hinojosa.
Yes.
Maria Hinojosa is a senior correspondent for the PBS series Now. She anchors Latino USA, a weekly program on news and culture, which is heard, news and culture of the Latino community, which is heard on PBS. She was a CNN urban affairs correspondent from 1997 until this year. And earlier, she worked at National Public Radio as a New York-based correspondent. She's also hosted a number of public affairs talk shows on WNBC TV in New York. And she's received many awards and honors, including Latino Heritage Award from Columbia University and the Ruben Salazar Award from the National Council of La Raza. So welcome to all of you to the National Museum of American History. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. I'm hoping that what we can do here this evening is really a conversation. So just imagine that we're all sitting around at Raul's kitchen table where he just made us some fabulous tamales. Right?
Theoretically.
Tamales. He's like, oh yeah, I made them last night. Oh, absolutely. To make it conversational. And then, not too far into the program, I really wanted to open up to you, because clearly if you're here, it's because this means something to you. And you want to engage these extraordinary representatives of our living American history. So be thinking about the questions that you want to ask. I mean, I'm just floored. I'm honored. I can't believe I'm on the same stage with all of you. But it harkens back to my experience with civil rights in this country. Whenever I go out and I lecture, I talk about the fact that the first person who made me feel like I was part of this country, I'm a Mexican, born in Mexico City, raised in Chicago. The first person who made me feel like I was present here was Martin Luther King, who clearly looked nothing like me, and yet made me feel visible. And the person who made me feel visible as a Mexicana was Cesar Chavez. And my mom was not one of those people who read all the how-to books and how do you raise kids and what do you do and where do you take them. She just identified as a Mexicana raising her family in Chicago with the movement for civil rights, with Martin Luther King. And so she pulled me out of school when Cesar Chavez came to the south side of Chicago to talk about the Great Boycott. And we had to write a letter to my teacher about why we were doing this. This was kind of scandalous to take me out of school to go see this, but it was a moment that I will never forget. And I stopped eating grapes at that time and didn't start eating grapes really up until just like 2 years ago. I just couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to do that. The interesting thing is that I'm raising my children now as Mexican Dominican citizens of this country living in New York, and my son they're both in a progressive school in New York, and they spend a whole year learning about civil rights, and they study the Delano Grape Strike, and they know about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. So it is part of our American history, and one that we, I think, have to look at and learn the lessons from and look critically at it. But let me take you back for a second, Dolores, to when you realized that you were going to join this strike that had already started. No?
No. No, actually, and you know, it's interesting because I remember a reporter asking me, well, why did all these people go on strike? I mean, and what people don't remember or don't know actually is that before the strike, Cesar and I had been organizing in the San Joaquin Valley for 3 years because we started the union in 1962.
But that's what I was going to get to. When you realized that you were going to now take it from an organizational platform to something that was going to, in fact, join part of the strike and the boycott.
Well, we had actually, from the beginning, we were organizing a union, and we had meetings with many hundreds of workers in the San Joaquin Valley, having meetings in their homes, telling them that they could really make a difference and giving them that that strength. And of course, not all of the workers, but at least those workers that we were able to convince that they could make a difference, and they became members of our organization, which was the National Farm Workers Association. And actually, our original plan had been to organize for 5 years before we had any kind of a strike. And I just want to say that the conditions for workers, if you can imagine, we would go to homes where workers didn't have any linoleum or wood on their floors. They had dirt floors. They had cardboard boxes and orange crates for furniture. You had little children that were running around with no shoes and were very malnourished. The wages were then 50 cents an hour to 70 cents an hour. There was no such thing as food stamps or unemployment insurance. Farm workers even had trouble getting the surplus commodities. There had been laws in the state of California that in order to get the surplus food from the welfare department or whatever, that you had to live in one county for an entire year and show rent receipts. So things were very, very desperate for workers. And so to try to convince the workers that they could make a difference, that was what our task in organizing was. So we organized for, from 1962 to 1965. And we were not going to do any kind of a strike until, a couple of years later.
I have to ask you though, that idea of understanding from the time that you started that it was going to take 5 years worth of organizing before you even thought about a strike or a boycott, that's pretty visionary at that point, to know that you were going to have 5 years before you might see any fruit of your labor, quote unquote.
Now, well, the fruit of the labor was getting the workers convinced to join. That was that was the labor that we were doing. And had it not been for the Filipino workers that kind of went on strike ahead of us. And I just have to say, to add to that, is that the leader of the Filipino workers, Larry Itleong, and I had worked together in Stockton. In fact, I organized Larry Itleong because under the Community Service Organization, which was the group that we belonged to before we started the union, we had a farm labor committee. And Larry and I had worked together because we formed a large group of workers called the Agricultural Workers Association, which then became the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. And I left that group because they started working with the labor contractors. But the Filipino had a whole different system of working, which they called the crew leader system, where the leader would actually negotiate with the growers, and they would set up their own kitchens and buy their own food. And so that system worked for them, while it didn't work for the Mexican workers or the black workers or the Okie workers, right? And so I left them, and then that's when Cesar and I decided to start the National Farm Workers Association. But they went on strike, they kind of jumped the gun, and so we had to, decide to support them.
Andy, talk about the identity politics at that time, 40 years ago, with Filipino workers and Mexicano workers. I mean, so much of what we hear right now at this moment in history in this country is divisive in terms of new immigrants or undocumented immigrants or minorities versus minorities. What was the reality like in terms of the relationship between the Filipino workers and the Mexicano workers?
Well, actually in the beginning or before the strike in Delano, there was some kind of mistrust between the two groups, see? Because the growers have used that for so many years, trying to poison the mind of the Filipino against the Mexican workers. The Mexican workers were also told that the Filipinos were homosexuals, etc. Yeah? Because you see, that was the way that the growers could control the situation in the farm. When the two groups do not get together. In fact, in previous years, when the Chicano workers Mexican workers will go on strike, the Filipino workers will cross the picket line and scab. So when the Filipino workers will go on strike, the Mexican workers will go on work. So the problem there was that it was difficult to maintain a strike. But when the AWO and the NFWA merged later on, it was very difficult for the growers to say, this and that, because we begin to realize that the Mexicans were our brothers, and the Mexican, like Cesar, called everybody brothers and sisters. And we begin to love each other, Dolores and I used to work together, no problem. We work in the board. We did not have any problems anymore.
It was that one-to-one relationship.
Yes.
I'm a Mexicano, you're a Filipino. We can meet each other and see each other?
All of a sudden, we realized that we have the same demands. You know, when we work together in the field, and then during the merger, we decided to accept that Cesar should be the leader. And there was no question at all, because Cesar was a good leader, you see. When Cesar wanted this, he got it from us. And the same thing, you know, right?
Yes.
And the growers decided, well, you know, it's very difficult now because we were together.
Luis, when you think back about at that moment, so, you know, as I'm getting older, you know, you wonder about seismic moments in history. In fact, I was speaking to Reverend Calvin Butts from New York, who was saying that he believes that what we just witnessed post-Katrina is a seismic moment in American history. It has changed the dynamic. At that moment, though, 40 years ago, did you think this is a seismic moment, what we're doing here is going to change things, or did you just say, you know, I love my theater, I love the farm workers, I love what I'm doing, and we're satisfied with the fact that we were able to start this strike and this boycott?